Hello, my name is Recky, and welcome back for another or the first NATO reaction. I found a video on the infographic show while browsing the YouTube world, and the title actually got me thinking. It's a bit heart wrenching if it's actually true. I'm very keen to find out how and why, basically. The title is Why NATO Can't Rely on the United States to Stop a Russian Invasion. I'm really hoping that is not true because we cannot do this without you. Eventually, I mean, we can probably put a stop to a lot of it, helping with the help from the other bigger nations we have here in West Europe. But to be honest, in the end of it, we need you, and hopefully that is just a clickbait, really. If you haven't checked out the infographic show yet, you find the link for the video we're going to watch, and of course, the channel located right down there in the description. Yeah, hopefully it's not true. Before we watch, we say thank you so much to the channel members of the Patreon. Thank you so much for the incredible, cool support. And a big shout out to the Supreme Tier donators over by Patreon, and of course, channel membership. You guys rock. Thank you. And we have a personal shout out to the ultimate supporters, only available on Patreon. Deja Walt, Dwayne, Dana Troy, Robert Matt Lon, and Barbara. Let's find out if this is actually true, or if I actually understand it. Like why? I'm a bit scared though. What if everything he says just makes sense, right?
Let's say Russia wins the war in Ukraine. But rather than sit back and enjoy the victor's spoils, Vladimir Putin begins to systematically attack NATO targets across Europe and the rest of the globe. Worse still, NATO receives no support from its biggest and most powerful ally, the United States.
What did he say? Is it a clickbait though? I feel like he said
Begins to systematically attack NATO targets across Europe and the rest of the globe. Worse still, NATO receives no support from its biggest and most powerful ally, the United States. A nightmare scenario or a terrifying reality? According to a report by IntelliNews citing the German newspaper Bild, such an attack could come as quickly as February or July of this year. And even though the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov was quick to refute such claims, stating recently this newspaper has regularly stooped to publishing various fake news items and canards, many leading political commentators predict that Russia will attack NATO's eastern flank sooner rather than later. If accurate, this unprecedented show of aggression would herald a huge armed battle in Europe and likely precipitate World War III. However, any invasion wouldn't be confined to just military action. Russia would commence hostilities with cyber attacks and hybrid modern warfare techniques, the likes of which were linked to election interference and destabilization tactics in many leading Western countries in recent
years. That is something I can actually do. That is something I can actually believe. In Russian invasion doesn't have to mean boots on the ground, doesn't have to mean planes bombing or inserting, doesn't have to mean submarine and sea vessels to attack harbors. It could actually just be attacking NATO members' infrastructure. It could be hospital networks and stuff like that with hacker attacks. That is something I do believe could happen.
Years, primarily in the Baltic states, before launching an attack on Poland's eastern borders. To understand how these predictions have gone from mere scaremongering to genuine concern, we have to rewind the period immediately preceding Russia's attack on Ukraine. We're talking about Putin's repeated warnings to the West regarding NATO expansion into Central and Eastern Europe, and ultimately a new NATO base in Poland. Let's not forget the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997, ostensibly.
The NATO-Russia Founding Act 1997 does not prohibit expansion of military facilities in case of threat of aggression, as was the case post-97.
Prohibiting the U.S. from having permanent bases in the region. In a report from the New York Times, the case for invasion of Ukraine was outlined by Russia as follows. It's a fact that over the past 30 years, we have been patiently trying to come to an agreement with the leading NATO countries regarding the principles of equal and indivisible security in Europe. In response to our proposals, we invariably faced either cynical deception and lies or attempts at pressure and blackmail, while the North Atlantic Alliance continued to expand despite our protests and concerns. Has Putin got a legitimate reason to feel aggrieved? And is Russia's current stance somewhat justified? Not according to the US. They feel that Putin effectively nullified the act with his annexation of Crimea in 2014 and subsequent invasion of Ukraine 8 years later. To counter Russian aggression in Europe, US President Joe Biden has endorsed any such measures. In a moment where Putin has shattered peace in Europe and attacked the very tenets of the rule-based order, the United States and our allies, we're stepping up. He feels the US is in the midst of a fight between democracies and oligarchs.
And I know that Trump said about a bunch of things that actually got very heated. Rumors of leaving NATO, uh, more or less telling Russia to attack NATO countries that does not have met the requirement how much cash they actually spend on forces. Uh, I'm not saying it's completely bullcrap, but then again, one thing I do agree with that statement from former President Mr. Donald Trump is that if a country doesn't pay enough cash, I think it's 2.2% of the is it BMP? I think it's BP, BMP. I think it's BMP. And I understand some countries maybe not is not possible to actually put 2.2 percent of the entire no BMP. You know what I mean? And I think that's going to be the biggest issue. Some countries cannot do that. However, maybe some countries can, but they ain't doing it because they don't want to put money in that now because they have to fix the issues with healthcare or schools and social affairs, whatever it is. And I think that's the reason why he said that. I don't think he said it because he wants Russia to attack the weak ones. Yeah.
Figures speak for themselves. There are now around 100,000 US troops temporarily deployed in Central and Eastern Europe, and while that might appear to be a small number compared to the 370,000 troops that were deployed in Europe in the late 1980s before the fall of the Berlin Wall, it still constitutes a significant force, one that has irked Moscow for years. But if that's the case and the US is keen to further expand its European military presence, why can't NATO rely on the superpower's support, especially if Putin does the unthinkable and attacks their bases in the Baltic states and Poland? That question has many complex, multifaceted answers, but perhaps the biggest and most relevant of those imponderables is the upcoming US presidential election. Despite a slew of increasingly complex legal problems in the US, it now looks likely that the controversial former President Donald Trump will secure the Republican nomination and take on Biden in the November election. If the current polls are to be believed, Trump holds a slim but perhaps significant 2% advantage over Biden, at least as of the making of this video. Should those predictions prove correct and Trump was re-elected, what would his stance be toward NATO and the involvement in any military conflict with Vladimir Putin, a leader he has previously expressed admiration toward?
I'm going to be completely honest. I know there's a lot of Americans saying that that is not a war uh, until you have to. I mean, if there's a war breaking out, just like it was in World War One and World War Two, United States came to aid, and I feel like I understand that. Why are we doing this again? That is not our problem. But this time, when it comes to Russia, it could actually be a problem in the future. I don't believe it. I highly doubt it. If I'm going to be completely honest, I highly doubt that there's going to be a World War III because of all the good sides and all the bad sides have nuclear things. So if that happens, we're all dead. That's one thing for sure.
Paul Quirk, a political scientist at the University of British Columbia in Canada, summed up the nature of their relationship in the following terms for Newsweek magazine. Trump, as president, was extraordinarily and very suspiciously responsive to Putin and Russia and hostile toward NATO. NATO's vital importance for American interests makes Trump look bad. So it's no secret that Trump had a strained relationship.
And I think it actually said here, after writing the script, Trump said he would encourage Russia to attack NATO members who were not meeting 2% spending
For
goals.
American interests makes Trump look bad.
There it is,
So
right
it's no
there.
secret that Trump had a strained relationship with NATO during his presidency and pretty much any other organization that didn't 100% align with the America First policies that dominated his agenda, and is opening to cooperating with the Kremlin. In an article featured in The Atlantic in 2024, he was quoted as saying, "I don't give a bleep about NATO, and their conflicts are not worth American lives. Pulling back from Europe would save this country millions of dollars annually." Former National Security Advisor John Bolton
It's sad to hear it, but I'm going to be honest with you. I understand it at the same time. America first, I understand it completely.
puts Trump's stance toward NATO and the U.S.'s historical allies in the following chilling terms. The damage he did in his first term was reparable. The damage in the second term would be irreparable. So, a Trump re-election could well be the reason why alarm bells are ringing across Europe, and especially within NATO. But how likely is a Trump victory? Again, that's a hard question to answer. For anyone looking from the outside in, the former president and billionaire businessman's position looks tenuous to say the least. In another report from The Atlantic, this time from January 17th, it's reported that Trump currently faces 91 felony counts across 2 state courts and 2 different federal districts, any of which could potentially result in a prison term. These charges are incredibly serious and range from fraud, sexual assault, defamation, bribery, to the removal of official government documents from the White House and election subversion.
What is how did he say that?
Are incredibly serious and range from fraud, sexual assault, defamation.
What is defamation? I know fraud. I know sexual assault. I know bribery. I know removal of official government documents and election subversion. Help me out, the defamation and subversion, because I don't know what that means.
Bribery, to the removal of official government documents from the White House, and election subversion, or in effect treason, following his refusal to accept defeat in the 2020 presidential election. Some states and lawsuits could see him disqualified from running for president altogether. Despite all the lawsuits, Trump remains incredibly popular with some sections of the American electorate. You only need to look at his recent victories in the primaries in Iowa and New Hampshire. Whatever his harshest critics might think, it's unlikely that any other figure in political history would have been able to survive the fallout from such claims and still be considered a viable presidential candidate by a huge swath of the population, all of which makes him an exceedingly dangerous and hugely unpredictable proposition, not just for NATO, but the wider world. But perhaps all is not lost even if Trump is reelected. Remember, any decision to leave NATO would have to go through the U.S. Senate, and that would be a difficult, if not almost impossible, motion for the new Trump administration to push through, and could
that is, of course, he's not a dictator, so he cannot make decisions without actually going through the Senate. I mean, I understand completely that America first. I am with you on that one. But the 2%, that might be depending on if if the country actually can put 2% in, or are they actually focusing on something else. That is a completely different story. You got to see through. Why are you putting? Okay, you're putting on healthcare because it sucks. Cool. Yeah, hurry up with that and just start with the 2% as fast as you can. Cool. Or why are you not putting 2%? Well, we just want to have girls just want to have fun.
Even lead to a constitutional crisis. Election intrigue aside, what of America's obligations to the global community, its international partners and close allies, since the signing of various post-Second World War treaties? That's where we come to one big stumbling block, and up till now a huge deterrent to any large-scale Russian military action in Europe. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty constitutes the very basis, heart, and soul of the Alliance of Nations. But what is Article 5, and why might it stop Russia from attacking NATO? The North Atlantic Treaty, NATO's founding treaty signed in 1949, sought to create a pact of mutual assistance to counter the threat of the Soviet Union if it tried to extend its control over Eastern Europe. Every NATO nation made Article 5, a pact of collective defense, a key component of the alliance itself. The crux of the treaty can be neatly summarized as follows. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked. Thus, the U.S. is legally obliged to rush to the defense of any country targeted by Russian aggression, right? Not if Trump and his political supporters get their way and effectively leave NATO. But is that even possible? In a word, yes. Article 13 of the North Atlantic Treaty states, after the treaty has been in force for 20 years, any party may cease to be a party 1 year after its notice of denunciation. More worrying, many voices of opposition have been making a case for America deserting the Union. In a Newsweek report from July of 2023, Republican Representative from Georgia Marjorie Taylor Greene called NATO not a reliable partner and claimed that other members are not paying their fair share.
One thing I do want to say that there is countries that is currently members of NATO that I do not think they should be there. It's a minefield. I mean, I don't feel like we have countries with dictators should be a member of NATO. I'm not saying we should restrict it to Western world. However, there's definitely countries that shouldn't be there for humanitarian reasons. I'm gonna be completely honest with you.
An election year when many Americans have seen their living standards hit by the numerous different and complex conflicts raging around the world, the desertion of an organization that's seen on a drain on American resources could be exceedingly popular. Put simply, the economy is a hugely important factor to the majority of Americans. The question that remains is whether or not the economic prosperity on a domestic level in the U.S. can come at the cost of global security, and whether or not the two are inextricably linked. The nightmare scenario for the long-term security of Europe and beyond was succinctly summed up by Thomas Gift, founding director of the Center on U.S. Politics at University College London. It's not out of the question, he said, that a future administration, namely a Trump one, would take an anti-globalist agenda to the point of pulling the plug on the alliance. Biden, for his part, is trying to paint a rosier picture. After securing one of the biggest election victories in U.S. history when he defeated Trump back in 2020, he told a recent summit in Lithuania that the U.S. has an ironclad commitment to NATO. Today, our alliance remains a bulwark of global security and stability as it's been for more than 7 decades. NATO is stronger, more energized, and yes, more united than ever in its history. However, many would argue that this simply is not true, and if Biden isn't re-elected, a radical shift in policy could bring down the curtain on 70 years of cooperation and leave the door open for Putin to attack NATO bases in Eastern and Central Europe. If that potentially devastating possibility became a reality, what sort of resistance would he face on the ground? For starters, one of the biggest, most modern and well-equipped armies in the world, Poland. In recent history, the Poles found themselves helplessly sandwiched between not just two of the most powerful warring nations on the continent, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler and Soviet Russia under Joseph Stalin, but the prevailing ideologies of capitalism and communism. Naturally, in the relatively peaceful post-Cold War years, Poland has systematically transformed itself into a military power in its own right. The country has taken steps to never again find itself helpless and open to invasion and occupation, and no one could blame them. But would Poland be able to withstand a full-blown Russian attack, the likes of which Ukraine has only been able to repel with significant help from the US and its other allies, especially when the US might well refuse to become involved in any conflict, whether directly or indirectly? Let's look at some facts and figures. According to a Euronews report from 2023, Poland has big plans.
I gotta love the fact that the Polish said, "Well, never again shall we stand here being defeated for 2 weeks by another country," and they just said that. And it's 2024, and they're still kicking some serious butt. It's just reinforcing and actually making the armed forces even more powerful. Good job to Poland.
In regard to strengthening and expanding its military. Over the next 10 years, Warsaw wants to recruit about 150,000 troops, bringing its army from the current 128,000 active personnel and 36,000 territorial defense troops to 300,000 soldiers. By way of comparison, the UK, a nation with a long and proud military tradition, had 142,560 personnel serving in the British Armed Forces in 2023. It's an indicator of not just how far Poland has come, but how seriously the country is taking its military defenses in an increasingly uncertain world. But what about hardware? Poland has purchased over 1,000 new tanks and 600 artillery pieces, mainly from South Korea and the US, all of which gives the country more firepower than the UK, France, Germany, and Italy combined. Those numbers would be unthinkable during the height of the Cold War, but they're a cold hard fact today, showing just how determinedly Poland would repel any Russian show of aggression. But it doesn't end there. They also boast 33 new M1 Abrams tanks as part of a €4.5 billion or $4.9 billion order of 250. Poland is also waiting the delivery of around 1,000 K2 Black Panther main battle tanks from South Korea, 10 of which are already in their growing arsenal. Toss 180 K2s to the mix, expected by 2025, and up to 820 additional tanks, and you get an even better idea of just what Poland currently brings to the table and what it'll be capable of in the short to medium term. When it comes to the country's emerging artillery capabilities, Poland spent €9.2 billion to purchase 468 HIMARS rocket launchers. They're a potentially battle-altering piece of equipment, the type used by Ukrainian forces against the Russians over the past 2 years. The Polish army must be so powerful that it does not have to fight due to its strength alone, said Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki.
I think that Poland is just nailing that, hammering that nail down due to the fact that they are showing that we will stand alone if we have to, and we can stand alone if you have to. Man, I'm jealous.
In November of 2023, the ultimate aim of the current Polish government is to build the most powerful land forces in Europe. If Putin were to shift focus to NATO targets within Poland's borders, or even launch a full-blown invasion of the country itself, it would be safe to say that he would face even stiffer resistance than he has in Ukraine. Poland has not only sufficient troop numbers, but also the requisite military hardware to defend its territories against any proposed invasion. But would this even be enough to deter Putin from risking another giant roll of the geopolitical dice? To answer that question, we need to take a closer look at the current conflict in Ukraine. First and foremost, Russia has suffered major losses in the war that's already lasted far longer than Putin predicted at the onset of the invasion. A report from Reuters in December 2023 estimated that Russia has suffered losses to the tune of 315,000 dead or wounded troops. To provide an appropriate and awful historical context, in the brutal and bloody 9-year war in Afghanistan, Russia lost 14,500 troops. But there isn't only the human cost to calculate in any war. Russia's also suffered a huge loss in terms of military hardware. According to a Newsweek report from 2023, as the conflict approached its 600th day, Russian forces had lost 4,965 tanks, 9,385 armored personnel vehicles, and just under 7,000 artillery systems. Total Russian aircraft losses totaled 318, as well as more than 5,200 drones, 20 boats, and 1 submarine, infamously targeted by cruise missiles in September of that same year. Frederick Mertens, a strategic analyst with the Hague.
That is a lot of stuff. It's not going good, we all know that, but getting that numbers completely blew me away. Completely.
Center for Security Studies made the following observation about the toll of the conflict on Russian forces. Destroying your enemy remains your first priority in battle, and Ukraine seems to have done far better than the Russians. All of which shows what a devastating impact the war in Ukraine has had on both Russian troop numbers and the Kremlin's coffers. As a result, would Russia be in a position to attack NATO targets or even invade the Baltic states and Poland anytime soon? Worryingly, Putin probably thinks so. Why? According to a report from Defense Post, Putin plans to seriously overhaul his military forces by 2026. But what does this expansion consist of exactly? And would it help to lead Russia to ultimate victory? If the rumblings coming out of the Kremlin are to be believed, this will mean a dramatic increase in troops, bringing numbers up to 1.5 million active personnel, as well as infrastructure, armament buildup, and structural reorganization. The Institute for the Study of War, ISW, sees this as a clear plan designed to build a significantly stronger Russian military quickly. However, the ISW did deliver a significant caveat to that claim, and this would significantly affect the country's capabilities of attacking NATO targets in the future. While Russia might be able to maintain the tempo of their localized offensive operations in eastern Ukraine in the near term, it is unclear if Russian forces would be able to conduct effective rotations in the long term or in the event of intensified Russian offensive efforts or a significant Ukrainian counteroffensive operation. But why would Russia want to build its military strength quickly? The obvious answer is to boost their flagging attempts to conclude the conflict in Ukraine. However, many would argue that Putin has always been playing the long game concerning any military expansion, and not just concerning the current war. For proof, take a look north. The Arctic region is considered a crucial geopolitical stronghold and the key to future world domination for any aspiring superpower. Since 2005, Putin has reopened and refurbished many military bases in the North Atlantic, to the point that Russia now has many more active facilities than NATO and the US combined. These sites are host to icebreakers, with which Russia hopes to open a lucrative trade route linking the North Atlantic to its strategic partners in Asia, nuclear submarines, significant troop deployment and missile tests, not to mention the untapped resources. All of this presents a whole new and worrying picture. But will that include Russian attacks on NATO? For many, talk of a Russian attack on NATO or invasion of any countries affiliated with the organization is premature, to say the least, but not completely out of the question. More conservative predictions suggest a Russian conflict with NATO forces won't take place for another 5 to 8 years at the earliest. Still, whatever the timelines involved, Europe and the rest of the world better prepare themselves for a war to end all wars. All of which brings us full circle. Undoubtedly, the global political situation is tense, fraught, and potentially as dangerous as it has been at any time since the end of the Cold War. In addition to the conflict in Ukraine and ongoing hostilities between Israel and Hamas, many other countries and political or militant groups are perpetrating aggressive acts against each other on a daily basis, from the Houthis to the Wagner Group all the way back to Hezbollah. Whether for territorial, geopolitical, or ideological reasons, you could argue with some justification that the world is teetering on the brink. One decisive push in a certain direction, and any number of wars could break out in any part of the globe at any given time. But what
The thing he says is like there's fires all around the world, small fires. We got a bigger fire, of course, in the Ukraine Russian war because it's closer to us. But as he said, we got Israel and Hamas and the Houthis, and there's a lot of fires going on. And this might actually be uh, the fire to start all fires, or the big one.
What of the United States, the self-professed world police force, a country that's never backed away from intervening on a global level or balked from sending troops to every corner of the globe? If Trump finds himself back in the White House at the end of the year, will that significantly increase the risk of war breaking out between Russia and NATO? And perhaps more pertinently, how would NATO fare without arguably its most powerful and influential member, should the US choose to leave the organization? How much of Vladimir Putin's aggressive rhetoric should the global community take at face value? For many years, the Russian leader warned the West, and most directly NATO, against any military expansion plans in Central and Eastern Europe. It is the red line which we have spoken about on numerous occasions. They have crossed it. The result? Invasion of Ukraine and all that's come with it. At some point in 2024, the Russian premier is likely to have moved all of his chess pieces into place, meaning he'll be ready to strike. At that point, NATO has good reason to be worried, and with the war-weary Western powers struggling to justify continued military action and financial backing to the beleaguered Ukrainian nation, will anybody be able to stop Russia? But what do you think? Is a concerted Russian attack on NATO part of Vladimir Putin's long-term military strategy? Will NATO be able to rely on US support in the face of any aggression from the Kremlin? Perhaps the answers to all these questions and more lie with the upcoming presidential elections. When the American people finally speak, it may have seismic repercussions for peace and stability across the globe. Now check out China versus the United States 2023 military army comparison. Who would win? Or watch this video instead.
Oh, my days, my days. Again, I do understand the American First policy. I know you guys have issues over there just as well as we do. And I think that if I were Swede in that situation, I will say Sweden first, and as well as for America first. I think if you can't deal with the crap you have at home, and then you start crap somewhere else. But I do hope from the bottom of my heart that if crap actually hits the fan in 2026, 27, whenever it is, um, the NATO members can count on the United States, even though the policy American first. Let me know what you think. Would you agree to send troops or whatever to aid Europe? What do you think? Heck no. America first. We deal with our own problems. That's it. If you did enjoy this, don't forget to smack the like and, of course, hit that subscribe. I would greatly appreciate that. And, of course, until next time, I'm Recky. You stay safe.